The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Richard Pemberton, a wealthy businessman from Texas who had made his fortune in oil. His designer clothes and expensive watch marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way. At 52, Richard had never encountered a situation where money couldn't solve his problems, or where his American citizenship didn't command immediate respect. Richard pushed through, the crowd with little regard for the families and elderly visitors around him. His wife, Margaret, followed reluctantly, embarrassed by his behavior but too afraid to speak up after 30 years of marriage. Their teenage daughter, Emma, trailed behind, her face buried in her phone, pretending not to notice the disapproving looks from other tourists. The palace guards stood motionless in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. Their discipline was legendary, trained to remain absolutely still regardless of what happened around them. For centuries, these guards had protected British royalty, and their unwavering dedication had become a symbol of British tradition and honor. Richard had been drinking since breakfast, celebrating what he called a successful business deal. The alcohol had amplified his already arrogant personality, making him louder and more aggressive than usual. He began taking photos directly in front of the guards, ignoring the rope barriers and the polite requests from palace staff to step back. "These guys are like living statues," Richard announced loudly to his family. "Watch this, I bet I can make him move." He started making faces at one of the guards, a young man named James Fletcher who had served in the British Army for 8 years before joining the Queen's Guard. James had seen combat in Afghanistan and had earned several commendations for his service. But none of that training had prepared him for what was about to happen. The crowd began to notice Richard's increasingly inappropriate behavior. Parents pulled their children closer, and other tourists started whispering among themselves. A palace security officer approached Richard politely, explaining that he needed to maintain a respectful distance from the guards. Richard's response was swift and angry. "Do you know who I am?" Richard shouted, his face reddening. "I've paid more in taxes this year than you make in a decade. These guards work for me as much as they work for your queen." The security officer remained professional, but Richard's voice was carrying across the courtyard, drawing more attention. Margaret tugged at her husband's sleeve, begging him to calm down. "Richard, please, people are staring," she whispered. But Richard was beyond reasoning. The combination of alcohol, jet lag, and his natural entitlement had created a perfect storm of bad judgment. What happened next would be captured on dozens of smartphones and would soon spread across social media like wildfire. Richard approached Guard Fletcher directly, standing just inches from his face. The young guard remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead, even as Richard began shouting insults about British history, the monarchy, and what he perceived as outdated traditions. "You're nothing but a tourist attraction," Richard spat, literally, "a grown man playing dress-up for my entertainment." The crowd gasped as they realized what had just happened. Richard Pemberton, an affluent American tourist, had actually spat on a member of the Queen's Guard. The moment seemed to freeze in time. Guard Fletcher's face remained expressionless, but those who looked closely could see a slight tightening around his eyes. The other guards maintained their positions, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Palace security moved in quickly, but before they could reach Richard, something unexpected began to happen. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd stepped forward. He was well-dressed but not wealthy, probably in his 70s, with the bearing of someone who had seen much in his life. "Excuse me, young man," he said to Richard in a crisp accent. "That guard you just insulted served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He's earned more respect in one day than you've shown in your entire life." Other tourists began to speak up. A family from Germany expressed their disgust at Richard's behavior. A group of Japanese visitors, despite their typically reserved nature, clearly showed their disapproval. What had started as one man's arrogant display was rapidly becoming a public humiliation. But the real surprise was yet to come. As palace security finally reached Richard, preparing to escort him away, Guard Fletcher did something that no one expected. For the first time in the entire incident, he moved, not to retaliate or to break protocol, but to perform an action that would change everything. Fletcher reached into his uniform and pulled out a handkerchief. With slow, deliberate movements that maintained his military bearing, He wiped his face clean. Then, instead of dropping the handkerchief or putting it away, he folded it carefully and extended it toward Richard. The gesture was so unexpected, so dignified, and so powerful that the entire crowd fell silent. Here was a man who had been publicly humiliated and assaulted, offering his attacker the very cloth he had used to clean himself. It was a moment of such grace under pressure that it left everyone speechless. Richard, still drunk and angry, didn't understand the magnitude of what had just happened. He knocked the handkerchief away and continued his tirade, but his words seemed to fall into a void. The crowd's attention had shifted completely. They were no longer watching an ugly American tourist behaving badly. They were witnessing something profound about human dignity and character. Palace security finally took Richard by the arms, but he continued to struggle and shout as they led him away. Margaret followed, her face burning with shame, while Emma had stopped pretending to ignore what was happening and was staring at the guard with something like awe. As Richard was escorted from the palace grounds, the crowd began to disperse, but many people remained, looking at Guard Fletcher with new eyes. The elderly British gentleman who had first spoken up approached the rope barrier and nodded respectfully to the guard. Others followed his example, creating an impromptu show of support for the young soldier who had shown such remarkable composure. What none of them knew was that this incident was being recorded not just by tourists, but by palace security cameras and by several professional photographers who happened to be covering the ceremony. Within hours, the story would begin to spread, but not in the way Richard Pemberton expected. Instead of being forgotten as just another rude tourist incident, this moment would become something much larger, touching on themes of respect, dignity, and the power of grace under pressure. The handkerchief that Richard had knocked away lay on the cobblestones, a small piece of cloth that had become a symbol of something much greater than anyone could have imagined. News traveled fast in the digital age, but some stories seemed to have wings of their own. Within 3 hours of the incident at Buckingham Palace, the first video appeared on social media. It had been posted by Sarah Chen, a college student from California who had been visiting London with her study abroad group. She had captured the entire confrontation on her phone, from Richard's initial aggressive behavior to Guard Fletcher's extraordinary response with the handkerchief. Sarah's video was shaky and the audio wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed everything that had happened. She had posted it with a simple caption: "American tourist spits on British guard. What the guard does next will restore your faith in humanity." Within the first hour, the video had been shared 200 times. By the end of the day, it would reach millions. Meanwhile, Richard Pemberton sat in a London police station, slowly sobering up and beginning to realize the severity of his situation. The charges against him included assault, public disorder, and disrespecting a public official. His expensive lawyer, hastily contacted by Margaret, was flying in from New York, but even she couldn't undo what had already been done. Margaret sat in their luxury hotel room, watching the news coverage with growing horror. Emma had locked herself in the bathroom, refusing to come out as notifications flooded her phone from classmates back home who had seen the video. The family's carefully constructed image of success and respectability was crumbling in real time. Back at Buckingham Palace, Guard Fletcher had completed his shift without any further incident. His commanding officer, Colonel Patrick Morrison, called him into his office that evening. Morrison was a career military man who had served alongside Fletcher in Afghanistan and had personally recommended him for the Queen's Guard. "James," Colonel Morrison said, closing the door behind them, "I've seen the video. The whole world has seen the video by now. What you did out there today, that handkerchief gesture, where did that come from?" Fletcher sat at attention, his uniform still perfect despite the day's events. "Sir, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. She told me that when someone shows you who they really are, you should show them who you really are too. That man showed everyone his character. I thought I should show mine." Morrison nodded slowly. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. You know this is going to bring a lot of attention your way? The Palace press office has already received dozens of interview requests." "I understand, sir. I'd prefer to let my actions speak for themselves, if that's acceptable." What Fletcher didn't know was that his simple act of dignity had already begun to create ripples that would extend far beyond anything he could have imagined. The video had been picked up by major news networks in Britain, and international media wasn't far behind. But more importantly, It had struck a chord with ordinary people around the world who were hungry for examples of grace and dignity in an increasingly coarse and divided world. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a professor of social psychology at Oxford University, had been following the story since the afternoon. She recognized something significant in what had happened and decided to write about it for her blog, which was followed by academics and journalists worldwide. "What we witnessed today at Buckingham Palace," she wrote, "was a masterclass in emotional intelligence and conflict resolution. Guard Fletcher's response transformed what could have been a simple case of assault into a profound teaching moment about human dignity. By offering his handkerchief to the man who had just spat on him, he demonstrated that true strength lies not in retaliation, but in maintaining one's principles under pressure." Dr. Hartwell's analysis was shared widely, adding intellectual weight to what many people instinctively felt about Fletcher's actions. But the story was also resonating on a much more personal level with individuals around the world. In Chicago, Maria Rodriguez was showing the video to her teenage son, who had been struggling with bullying at school. "Look at how this soldier handled being attacked," she said. "He didn't lower himself to that man's level. He stayed who he was, and that made all the difference." In Tokyo, businessman Hiroshi Tanaka was discussing the incident with his colleagues during their lunch break. "This British soldier understands something about honor that we've been losing in modern business," he said. "When someone dishonors you, you don't dishonor yourself in response." Meanwhile, investigative journalists had begun digging into both men involved in the incident. What they discovered about Guard Fletcher only enhanced his growing reputation. James Fletcher, 26 years old, had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester. His father was a factory worker, his mother a school lunch lady. He had joined the army at 18, not because he had no other options, but because he wanted to serve his country. His military record was exemplary. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 commendations for bravery, and numerous letters of appreciation from local commanders. His fellow soldiers described him as someone who always looked out for others, never complained, and maintained his sense of humor even in the worst situations. But the journalists also uncovered something else about Fletcher that added another layer to the story. His younger brother David had been born with cerebral palsy, and James had spent much of his childhood helping to care for him. He had learned patience and compassion early in life, dealing with people who stared, made comments, or treated his brother poorly. James always said that David taught him more about strength than the army ever could. His mother, Patricia Fletcher, told a reporter, "He learned that real courage isn't about fighting back when someone hurts you. It's about staying kind when the world isn't kind to you." The contrast with Richard Pemberton couldn't have been more stark. As details about the American businessman emerged, a picture developed of a man who had been given every advantage in life, but had learned few lessons about character or humility. Born into wealth, educated at expensive private schools, he had inherited his father's oil business and expanded it ruthlessly, often at the expense of employees and communities. Former employees described a man who treated people as disposable, who flew into rages when he didn't get his way, and who seemed to believe that money could solve any problem or excuse any behavior. Several lawsuits had been filed against his company for environmental damage and worker safety violations, but perhaps most damaging to Richard's reputation was what happened next. Instead of showing any remorse for his actions, he doubled down. From his holding cell in London, he gave an interview to a sympathetic American news outlet, claiming that he was the victim of British anti-American sentiment and that Guard Fletcher's response had been a calculated insult designed to humiliate him. "That soldier made me look bad on purpose," Richard insisted. "He knew exactly what he was doing with that handkerchief stunt. It was a setup from the beginning. These Brits can't stand successful Americans, and they'll do anything to tear us down." The interview backfired spectacularly. Instead of generating sympathy for Richard, it revealed a man completely incapable of understanding what had actually happened or taking responsibility for his actions. The contrast between his continued arrogance and Fletcher's quiet dignity became even more pronounced. Social media erupted with criticism of Richard's latest statements. The hashtag #DodgeYourHandkerchiefHero began trending worldwide, referring to Guard Fletcher. Memes appeared comparing Fletcher's grace under pressure to Richard's continued lack of self-awareness. But more than just internet humor, something deeper was happening. People were beginning to see the incident as a symbol of larger issues about respect, dignity, and how we treat one another in an increasingly divided world. By the third day after the incident, Guard Fletcher's story had transcended social media and entered the realm of international diplomacy. The American ambassador to the United Kingdom, Jennifer Walsh, found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to address the incident publicly. Standing before reporters at the embassy, she chose her words carefully. The actions of one individual do not represent the values or character of the American people, Ambassador Walsh stated. We are deeply embarrassed by Mr. Pemberton's behavior and impressed by the dignity shown by Guard Fletcher. This incident reminds us all of the importance of treating others with respect, regardless of our nationality or circumstances. Her statement was diplomatically correct, but it did little to contain the growing international conversation about what the incident represented. Editorial writers around the world were using it as a launching point to discuss everything from tourism behavior to military honor to the nature of true strength. In Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald ran an editorial titled, "The Handkerchief That Spoke Louder Than Words." In France, Le Monde published a thoughtful piece about the difference between power and authority. Even newspapers in countries with historically tense relationships with Britain found themselves praising Guard Fletcher's response. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II herself had been following the story through her private secretary. At 95 years old, she had seen countless examples of both human nobility and human failure. But something about Fletcher's response had captured her attention. "I should like to meet this young man," she informed her private secretary, Sir Edward Young. His actions reflect the very best traditions of military service and personal character. Such behavior should be recognized properly. When word leaked that the Queen had expressed interest in meeting Guard Fletcher, the media attention intensified even further. Royal meetings with individual guards were extremely rare, usually reserved for situations involving acts of extraordinary heroism or years of distinguished service. The fact that the Queen wanted to personally acknowledge Fletcher's response to the spitting incident sent a powerful message about the values the monarchy wanted to promote. Meanwhile, Richard Pemberton's situation continued to deteriorate. His high-powered lawyer had arrived from New York, but the legal charges were the least of his problems now. Video footage had emerged showing that this wasn't the first time Richard had behaved badly while traveling. A hotel security camera from his stay in Paris the previous month showed him berating a young desk clerk until she cried. Another video from Rome showed him pushing past an elderly woman who was walking too slowly for his taste. These additional videos painted a picture of a man whose behavior in London hadn't been an isolated incident fueled by alcohol, but rather part of a pattern of entitlement and disrespect that followed him wherever he went. The revelations were damaging not just to Richard personally, but to his business empire as well. Environmental groups that had been fighting his company's oil drilling operations seized on the incident as evidence of the character of the man they were opposing. "This is who Richard Pemberton really is," said Dr. Amanda Foster, director of the Clean Earth Coalition. "A man who thinks his wealth gives him the right to abuse and humiliate anyone he encounters. Why would we expect him to treat the environment any differently than he treats people?" The business impact was swift and severe. 3 major investors pulled their funding from Pemberton Oil within 48 hours of the additional video surfacing. 2 international contracts were canceled, with the companies citing reputation concerns as their reason. Richard's net worth dropped by an estimated $200 million in less than a week. Back in Texas, employees at Pemberton Oil were dealing with their own crisis. Many had been proud to work for a successful company, but now they found themselves explaining to friends and family why they were associated with a man who had become an international symbol of ugly American behavior. Jennifer Martinez, who had worked in Pemberton Oil's accounting department for 12 years, spoke for many employees when she said, "We're not like him. Most of us are just regular people trying to make a living. But now when I tell people where I work, they look at me like I must be a terrible person too." The company's human resources department was flooded with resignation letters. Exit interviews revealed that employees were leaving not just because of embarrassment, but because they had lost faith in leadership that could behave so poorly and show so little remorse. Margaret Pemberton was facing her own reckoning. Married to Richard for 30 years, she had long justified his behavior as the price of their comfortable lifestyle. She had learned to ignore his treatment of waiters, clerks, and anyone else he deemed beneath his status. But seeing the worldwide reaction to his behavior forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about the man she had married and the life she had chosen. Their daughter Emma, a senior at an elite private school in Dallas, was dealing with the social fallout among her classmates. At 17, she was old enough to understand the implications of what her father had done, but young enough to be devastated by the judgment of her peers. "My friends keep showing me these memes about Dad," Emma confided to her mother during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "They're calling him Spitgate Dad and the handkerchief guy. I can't even go to school without people staring at me. And the worst part is, I agree with them. What Dad did was horrible." Margaret found herself in the impossible position of trying to defend a husband whose actions she couldn't actually defend. The family's social circle, once eager to associate with the wealthy Pembertons, began distancing themselves. Invitations to exclusive events stopped coming. Phone calls weren't returned, but perhaps the most telling response came from Richard's own father, 80-year-old Robert Pemberton, who had built the oil business that Richard had inherited. Despite being retired for over a decade, the elder Pemberton still commanded respect in Texas business circles. His public statement about his son's behavior was brief but devastating. "I am ashamed of what my son did in London," Robert Pemberton said. "I raised him to be better than this. I built this company on the principle that success should make you more generous, not more cruel. Richard has forgotten everything I tried to teach him about character and responsibility." The statement from his own father was perhaps the most damaging blow to Richard's reputation yet. It removed any possibility that his behavior could be excused as a momentary lapse in judgment or dismissed as cultural misunderstanding. His own family was repudiating his actions. While Richard's world was collapsing, Guard Fletcher's life was changing in entirely different ways. Letters and packages began arriving at Buckingham Palace addressed to him. The palace mailroom, accustomed to handling correspondence for the royal family, found itself dealing with an unprecedented volume of mail for an individual guard. The letters came from around the world. Children drew pictures of soldiers with handkerchiefs. Veterans wrote to express their pride in Fletcher's conduct. Teachers asked for permission to use his story as an example in discussions about character and integrity. Religious leaders of various faiths praised his embodiment of their teachings about responding to evil with good. One letter that particularly moved Fletcher came from David Chen, a 12-year-old boy in San Francisco whose parents had shown him the video. David wrote, "Dear Soldier Fletcher, I get picked on at school a lot because I'm small and wear glasses. After I saw what you did, I decided to try being like you instead of getting mad back. It actually worked better than fighting. Thank you for showing me how to be strong." Colonel Morrison made sure Fletcher saw some of the letters, believing it was important for the young soldier to understand the positive impact his actions were having around the world, but he also worked to protect Fletcher from the overwhelming attention, ensuring that his duties remained manageable and that he had support dealing with the sudden fame. The royal household moved with its characteristic blend of tradition and precision when it came to arranging the Queen's meeting with Guard Fletcher. Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, worked closely with Colonel Morrison to ensure that everything was handled with appropriate dignity and discretion. The meeting would take place in the Queen's private apartments at Windsor Castle, away from the media attention that continued to surround the story. On the morning of the meeting, Fletcher underwent his usual meticulous preparation, but this time with an additional layer of significance. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing carried the weight of representing not just himself, but the values that had made his response so memorable. Queen Elizabeth II had met thousands of people throughout her 70-year reign, but she approached this meeting with particular interest. In Fletcher's response to provocation, she saw embodied the qualities that she had tried to promote throughout her time as monarch: duty, dignity, and grace under pressure. The meeting lasted 30 minutes, far longer than the typical royal audience. They discussed Fletcher's military service, his family background, and his thoughts about the incident that had brought him to international attention. The Queen was particularly interested in his mention of his grandmother's wisdom about showing people who you really are. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman," the Queen observed. It's clear that she taught you something that many people never learn, that true strength is shown not in how you treat those who can help you, but in how you treat those who have hurt you. Fletcher's response was characteristically humble. Your Majesty, I was just doing what felt right in the moment. I never expected it to become such a big story. The best actions rarely seek attention, the Queen replied. They simply reflect the character of the person taking them. What you did that day reminded people that dignity and respect are choices we make, regardless of how others behave toward us. At the conclusion of their meeting, the Queen made an announcement that surprised even her closest advisors. She would be creating a special commendation for Fletcher, not for military valor in the traditional sense, but for exemplifying the highest ideals of public service and personal character. The Queen Elizabeth II Award for Outstanding Dignity and Service would be established. With Fletcher as its first recipient, the announcement sent another wave of media attention around the world, but this time, the focus was entirely positive. Editorial writers praised the Queen's decision to recognize character over traditional heroics. Military leaders in multiple countries expressed their appreciation for the recognition of values that were sometimes overlooked in an age that often celebrated more dramatic forms of courage. But the most significant response came from unexpected quarters. Schools around the world began incorporating Fletcher's story into their curricula. Teachers found that the handkerchief gesture provided a perfect example for discussions about conflict resolution, character development, and the power of choosing dignity over retaliation. Dr. Patricia Williams, an elementary school principal in Detroit, explained why she had introduced Fletcher's story into her school's character education program. We deal with bullying and conflict every day. When we show kids this video, they immediately understand that there's a different way to respond to being hurt or insulted. They see that you can be strong without being mean, that you can win without making the other person lose. The educational impact extended beyond elementary schools. Military academies began using the incident as a case study in leadership under pressure. Business schools incorporated it into discussions about maintaining professional standards under stress. Even diplomatic training programs found value in Fletcher's example of de-escalating conflict through dignified response. Meanwhile, Richard Pemberton's legal troubles were mounting. The British Crown Prosecution Service had decided to pursue the assault charges aggressively, partly due to the public nature of the incident, but also because of the principle involved. Spitting on a member of the Queen's Guard was treated as a serious offense, equivalent to assaulting any other public official in the line of duty. Richard's expensive legal team was discovering that their usual tactics weren't working in the British legal system. Attempts to negotiate a plea deal were rejected. Efforts to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding were undermined by the clear video evidence. Most damaging of all, Richard's own behavior since the incident had eliminated any possibility of claiming remorse or temporary impairment. His continued insistence that he was the victim, combined with the revelation of his pattern of abusive behavior toward service workers, had created a situation where prosecutors felt they were representing more than just one guard who had been spat upon. They were defending the principle that wealth and nationality didn't exempt anyone from basic standards of decent behavior. The trial was scheduled for 6 weeks after the incident, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict had already been rendered. Richard Pemberton had become an international symbol of entitled behavior, while James Fletcher represented the quiet dignity that many people felt was missing from modern public discourse. The contrast was made even more stark by how each man handled the ongoing attention. Fletcher continued his duties with the Queen's Guard, declining most interview requests and maintaining the professional demeanor that had made him famous in the first place. When he did speak publicly, it was to redirect attention away from himself and toward the values he represented. "I'm not special," Fletcher said in his only television interview, conducted by the BBC. "Any decent person would have done the same thing. I just hope that people remember that we all have choices about how we treat each other, and those choices matter more than we sometimes realize." Richard, by contrast, seemed incapable of stopping himself from making his situation worse. He gave multiple interviews to American media outlets, each one revealing more about his character and less about any genuine understanding of what he had done wrong. He complained about British justice, American media coverage, and what he saw as an international conspiracy to damage his reputation. His wife Margaret finally reached her breaking point after one particularly disastrous television appearance where Richard blamed guard Fletcher for orchestrating the entire incident for personal gain. That evening, she packed her bags and moved back to her sister's house in Houston, taking Emma with her. "I can't watch him destroy himself anymore," Margaret told a family friend. "But more than that, I can't be part of it. What he did was wrong, and his refusal to admit it is even worse. Emma deserves better than this." The separation made headlines, adding another layer to the ongoing story. But it also marked a turning point in how the incident was being perceived. Margaret's decision to leave her husband over his behavior and his response to criticism was seen as evidence that even those closest to Richard recognized that his actions were indefensible. Emma, despite the pain of her parents' separation, felt a sense of relief that her mother had finally taken a stand. At 17, she was old enough to understand that her father's behavior reflected poorly on their entire family, and she was beginning to grapple with questions about the kind of person she wanted to become. "I've been thinking a lot about that soldier's grandmother," Emma told her mother, "about showing people who you really are. I want to be someone different from Dad. I want to be someone who treats people well, especially people who can't do anything for me." The ripple effects of the incident continued to spread in ways that no one could have predicted. Fletcher's example had inspired not just individual reflection, but institutional changes. The U.S. Military Academy at West Point announced that it would be incorporating Fletcher's response into its honor code training, using it as an example of how to maintain dignity under attack. Corporate training programs began using the incident as a case study in customer service and conflict resolution. The basic principle that Fletcher had demonstrated, responding to poor behavior with consistent good character, was being recognized as applicable far beyond military service. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what social media dubbed the handkerchief challenge. People around the world began sharing stories of times when they had chosen dignity over retaliation, kindness over revenge. The movement celebrated small acts of grace that happened every day but were rarely noticed or honored. The challenge wasn't about grand gestures or heroic acts. It was about the ordinary moments when people chose to respond to rudeness with politeness, to cruelty with kindness, to disrespect with dignity. Fletcher's handkerchief had become a symbol of the power that ordinary people had to choose their response to the worst behavior of others. Hurt others, but from the determination to remain true to one's principles regardless of how others behave. Fletcher's acceptance speech was characteristically humble and brief. He thanked the Queen for the honor, his family for their support, and his fellow guardsmen for their friendship. But his most meaningful words were about the broader lesson he hoped people would take from the incident. "If this whole experience has taught me anything," Fletcher said, "it's that every day we have choices about how we treat other people. Those choices might seem small in the moment, but they add up to who we are as individuals and as a society. I hope that people remember not just what happened to me, but what they can choose to do when they face their own difficult moments." The ceremony concluded with Fletcher returning to his duties as a member of the Queen's Guard, but his life had been permanently changed by a single moment of grace under pressure. The handkerchief that had started it all was now displayed in the Imperial War Museum, not as a relic of conflict, but as a symbol of the power of dignity to transform even the ugliest human interactions into something meaningful and inspiring. The ripple effects of that moment continued to spread around the world, touching lives in ways that neither Fletcher nor Richard could have imagined when they first encountered each other on that morning at Buckingham Palace. 6 months after Guard Fletcher's award ceremony, the world had largely moved on to other stories, but the impact of the handkerchief incident continued to resonate in ways both profound and subtle. Schools that had incorporated Fletcher's story into their curricula reported measurable improvements in how students handled conflict. Military academies found that cadets were more likely to choose de-escalation over confrontation when dealing with difficult situations. James Fletcher himself had completed his service with the Queen's Guard and transitioned to a new role as a training instructor at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. His assignment was specifically requested by senior leadership who recognized that his combination of combat experience and demonstrated character made him Ideal for shaping the next generation of British officers, Fletcher approached his new role with the same quiet dedication that had characterized his response to Richard Pemberton's attack. He didn't lecture about dignity or character. Instead, he demonstrated these qualities daily in how he treated cadets, how he responded to mistakes, and how he handled the inevitable frustrations that came with training young soldiers. Cadet Sarah Williams, a 20-year-old from Liverpool who was struggling with the physical demands of training, later wrote about Fletcher's influence. Instructor Fletcher never made you feel stupid when you failed. He would just show you how to do it better, and trust that you would keep trying. When you're exhausted and frustrated and ready to quit, that kind of respect means everything. Meanwhile, Richard Pemberton had served 4 months of his 6-month sentence before being released for good behavior. His time in Pentonville prison had been a harsh education in humility for a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. Stripped of his wealth, power, and freedom, he had been forced to confront the reality of who he had become. Prison had not been kind to Richard. As a wealthy American who had committed a high-profile offense against a beloved British institution, he was not popular among his fellow inmates. He faced daily reminders that money and status meant nothing in a place where respect had to be earned through behavior and character. The turning point came 3 months into his sentence when Richard witnessed an incident that forced him to confront his own past actions. A new inmate, a young man with obvious mental health issues, was being bullied by other prisoners. Richard watched as the vulnerable man was humiliated and threatened, and for the first time, he truly understood what it felt like to see someone defenseless being attacked. That night, Richard lay awake thinking about Guard Fletcher standing motionless while being spat upon, unable to defend himself due to his duties and training. For the first time, Richard began to comprehend the courage it had taken for Fletcher to respond with dignity rather than anger, and the grace required to offer help to someone who had just assaulted him. Upon his release, Richard emerged from prison a fundamentally changed man. The arrogance and entitlement that had defined his personality for 52 years had been stripped away by months of powerlessness and reflection. He returned to Houston to find a world that had moved on without him. His ex-wife Margaret had filed for divorce and was building a new life with their daughter Emma. His brother Michael had successfully restructured Pemberton Oil and was running it according to the principles their father had originally established. Richard's first public statement after his release was unlike anything he had said before. Standing outside his lawyer's office in Houston, he spoke to a small group of reporters with a humility that would have been unrecognizable 6 months earlier. I owe an apology to Guard Fletcher, to the British people, to my family, and to everyone who was embarrassed by my behavior, Richard said. I spent 52 years thinking that having money meant I could treat people however I wanted. I was wrong, and it took losing everything for me to understand that. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to do better going forward. The statement was met with skepticism by many who remembered his previous refusal to take responsibility, but some observers noted the genuine change in his demeanor and tone. Gone was the bluster and blame-shifting that had characterized his previous statements. In its place was a quiet acknowledgement of failure and a tentative commitment to change. Richard's path to redemption would not be easy or quick. His reputation in business circles was permanently damaged, and most of his former social connections had moved on. He found himself living in a modest apartment and working as a consultant for small oil companies, earning a fraction of what he had once commanded. But perhaps most importantly, Richard began the slow process of trying to make amends for his behavior. He reached out to service workers he had mistreated over the years, offering genuine apologies and, where appropriate, financial compensation for the damage he had caused. Many of these gestures were rejected, but Richard continued anyway, understanding that the process was about changing himself rather than earning forgiveness from others. His most significant attempt at making amends came 8 months after his release from prison. Through intermediaries, Richard requested the opportunity to apologize personally to Guard Fletcher. The request was initially declined by Fletcher's representatives, who were concerned about media attention and the possibility that Richard's motives were not genuine. But Fletcher himself, when informed of the request, surprised everyone by agreeing to the meeting. If he's sincere about wanting to apologize, then I should give him that opportunity, Fletcher told Colonel Morrison. Besides, I'm curious to see if prison changed him as much as people say it has. The meeting was arranged for a quiet cafe in London, away from media attention. Both men arrived with representatives, but they sat alone at a corner table while their lawyers and assistants waited nearby. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and while neither man ever revealed the complete details of what was discussed, both described it as meaningful and necessary. Richard's apology was apparently comprehensive and genuine, covering not just the spitting incident but his entire pattern of entitled behavior. Fletcher's response was characteristically gracious, accepting the apology while making it clear that forgiveness was a process rather than a single moment. "He's not the same man who spat on me," Fletcher said afterward. "Prison and losing everything changed him in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. I don't know if he can sustain this change long term, but today he seemed genuinely sorry for what he did and committed to being different." For Richard, the meeting represented a crucial step in his ongoing transformation. Fletcher's willingness to meet with him and accept his apology provided a form of closure that allowed him to move forward with his efforts to rebuild his life on a foundation of character rather than wealth. The ripple effects of their original encounter continued to influence both men and countless others who had been inspired by Fletcher's example or troubled by Richard's behavior. Schools around the world continued to use the handkerchief incident as a teaching tool. Military units incorporated Fletcher's response into their training on maintaining discipline under pressure. Businesses used Richard's fall as a case study in how character failures could destroy even the most successful enterprises. But perhaps the most significant ongoing impact was in the countless small interactions, where people chose dignity over retaliation, kindness over cruelty, because they remembered a young guard who offered his handkerchief to a man who had just spat on him. The incident had become more than just a news story. It had become a touchstone for anyone trying to maintain their principles in difficult circumstances. Emma Pemberton, now in her first year at college, wrote her admissions essay about watching her father's public humiliation and subsequent transformation. She described how the incident had forced her to examine her own values and commit to treating all people with respect, regardless of their status or ability to help her. The trial of Richard Pemberton began on a grey Monday morning in London's Westminster Magistrates' Court. Despite the international attention the case had received, the proceedings themselves were conducted with the same careful attention to legal procedure that characterized all British court cases. The media was allowed limited access, but the focus remained firmly on the legal facts rather than the circus atmosphere that had surrounded the incident. The prosecution's case was straightforward and compelling. They presented clear video evidence of the assault, testimony from witnesses, and documentation of the charges. The Crown Prosecutor, Sarah Mitchell QC, methodically laid out the facts without sensationalism, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. "This case is not about international relations or cultural differences," Prosecutor Mitchell told the court. "It is about a simple principle that transcends nationality. No one has the right to assault another person, regardless of their wealth, status, or background." Mr. Pemberton chose to spit on Guard Fletcher while he was performing his duties. That action was wrong then, and it remains wrong now. Richard's defense team, led by prominent London barrister Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, attempted to minimize the severity of the incident. They argued that their client had been suffering from jet lag, had consumed alcohol, and had misunderstood British customs regarding interaction with the guards. They portrayed the spitting as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than a deliberate assault. But their defense was severely undermined by Richard's own behavior since the incident. His continued insistence that he was the victim, his pattern of similar behavior in other countries, and his complete lack of remorse made it impossible to present him as someone who had simply made a mistake. The most powerful moment in the trial came when Guard Fletcher took the stand. His testimony was brief, factual, and delivered with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his response to the original incident. He described what had happened without embellishment, answered questions directly, and showed no anger or desire for revenge. When Sir Geoffrey attempted to suggest that Fletcher's handkerchief gesture had been calculated to embarrass Richard, Fletcher's response was simple and devastating. "Sir, when someone spits on you, your first instinct is to clean yourself. I offered the handkerchief because I thought perhaps Mr. Pemberton might want to clean himself as well, both literally and figuratively." The courtroom was silent for a long moment after Fletcher's answer. Even Sir Geoffrey seemed momentarily at a loss for words. The judge, Magistrate Eleanor Thompson, made a note and moved the proceedings forward. But the impact of Fletcher's testimony was clear to everyone present. Outside the courthouse, public opinion was solidly behind Fletcher and against Richard. Demonstrators gathered daily, not to protest violently, but to show support for the values that Fletcher represented. Veterans organizations, police unions, and civic groups organized peaceful gatherings that emphasized dignity, respect, and service. The demonstrations were notable for their orderly nature and positive message. Instead of angry chants or harsh criticism of Richard, the protesters focused on celebrating the qualities they admired in Fletcher. Signs read "Dignity Matters," "Service before self," and "Character under pressure." The contrast with typical protests was intentional and powerful. Meanwhile, the business consequences for Richard continued to mount. Pemberton Oil was facing a cascade of problems that went far beyond his legal troubles. Environmental investigations that had been stalled for years suddenly received new funding and attention. Regulatory agencies that had previously given the company the benefit of the doubt began scrutinizing their operations more carefully. Most significantly, 3 major oil companies canceled partnerships with Pemberton Oil, citing incompatible corporate values as their reason. The loss of these partnerships threatened the company's ability to bid on major international projects, effectively cutting them out of billions of dollars in potential revenue. Richard's younger brother Michael, who served as the company's chief operating officer, found himself in an impossible position. He had always lived in Richard's shadow, accepting his brother's leadership despite personal misgivings about his character. Now he was watching the family business that their father had built being destroyed by Richard's arrogance and refusal to take responsibility. Consulting with the board of directors and the company's major shareholders, Michael made a decision that shocked the business world. He announced that he was leading a buyout effort to remove Richard from control of Pemberton Oil and restructure the company under new leadership. "My brother's actions do not represent the values that this company was founded on," Michael said at a press conference held at the company's Houston headquarters. "Our father built this business on principles of hard work, integrity, and respect for others. Richard has forgotten those principles, and his behavior has damaged not just his own reputation, but the reputation of everyone associated with this company." The corporate coup was swift and decisive. Michael had quietly secured the support of the board of directors, major shareholders, and key employees before making his announcement. Within 72 hours, Richard found himself stripped of his position as CEO and chairman, with his ownership stake reduced to a minority position that gave him no control over company operations. The business press hailed the move as a rare example of corporate accountability. But for Richard, it represented the complete collapse of everything he had built his identity around. Without his position as head of Pemberton Oil, he was just another wealthy man facing criminal charges in a foreign country, abandoned by his family and rejected by his own company. Back in the courtroom, the trial was reaching its conclusion. The defense had presented character witnesses who testified to Richard's charitable donations and business success, but their testimony seemed hollow in the face of the video evidence and Richard's own continued refusal to show genuine remorse. The most damaging moment for the defense came when Sir Geoffrey called Richard himself to testify. Against the advice of his legal team, Richard insisted on taking the stand. Convinced that he could explain his side of the story and convince the court that he was the victim of unfair treatment, his testimony was a disaster. Under gentle questioning from his own lawyer, Richard came across as arrogant and entitled. Under cross-examination from Prosecutor Mitchell, he became angry and defensive, revealing exactly the kind of character that had led to the original incident. When Prosecutor Mitchell asked if he felt any remorse for spitting on guard Fletcher, Richard's answer sealed his fate. "I regret that my moment of frustration has been blown out of proportion by people who want to make me a villain. That guard knew exactly what he was doing with that handkerchief stunt, and I'm the one who's been humiliated. Magistrate Thompson's verdict was delivered with the measured tone that characterized all her judicial decisions, but her words carried particular weight, given the international attention the case had received. She found Richard guilty of assault and public disorder, noting that his complete lack of remorse demonstrated a contempt for both the law and basic human decency. "Mr. Pemberton," she said, looking directly at the defendant, "you came to this country as a guest, and you behaved in a manner that would be unacceptable anywhere in the civilized world. Your actions dishonored not only yourself, but your country and your family. The fact that you continue to show no understanding of the gravity of your behavior suggests that you have learned nothing from this experience." The sentence was 6 months in prison, with the possibility of early release for good behavior, plus a substantial fine and a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom. Richard's legal team immediately announced their intention to appeal, but the damage to his reputation was complete and irreversible. As Richard was led away to begin his sentence, the contrast with Guard Fletcher could not have been more stark. While Richard faced imprisonment and social disgrace, Fletcher was preparing for a very different kind of recognition ceremony. The Queen Elizabeth II Award for Outstanding Dignity and Service was to be presented at Windsor Castle in a ceremony that, while private, would be recorded for posterity. The Queen herself would present the award, making it one of the most significant honors that could be bestowed on a serving member of the military. Fletcher's family was invited to attend the ceremony, including his parents, his brother David and his grandmother, whose wisdom had inspired his response to Richard's attack. For Patricia Fletcher, watching her son receive recognition from the Queen represented validation of everything she had tried to teach him about character and dignity. "James was always different," she told a reporter outside Windsor Castle. "He never needed to be the loudest or the strongest. He just needed to be good, and he worked at that every day of his life. I'm proud of him, but I'm not surprised. This is who he's always been." The ceremony itself was brief but deeply meaningful. The Queen spoke about the importance of maintaining dignity under pressure and the power of individual actions to inspire others. She noted that Fletcher's response to being attacked had reminded the world that strength comes not from the ability to. "I learned that character isn't tested when things are going well," she wrote. "It's tested when you're angry or frustrated or when someone treats you badly. My father failed that test spectacularly, but Guard Fletcher passed it beautifully. I want to be the kind of person who passes that test when my moment comes." 5 years after the incident that had changed both their lives forever, James Fletcher and Richard Pemberton found themselves in an unlikely partnership that no one could have predicted. Fletcher had left military service to establish a non-profit organization called the Handkerchief Foundation, dedicated to teaching conflict resolution and character development to young people. Richard, having spent years rebuilding his life and reputation through genuine service to others, had become one of the Foundation's most effective fundraisers and speakers. The Foundation's work had grown from Fletcher's recognition that the response to his story revealed a deep hunger in society for examples of dignity and grace under pressure. Children and adults alike seemed desperate for models of how to respond to conflict without descending into cruelty or revenge. The Foundation filled that need by developing programs that taught practical skills for maintaining character under stress. Fletcher's approach to teaching was the same as his approach to everything else: quiet, practical, and focused on results rather than recognition. The Foundation's programs didn't lecture about abstract principles. Instead, they provided real-world training in how to de-escalate conflicts, respond to bullying, and maintain dignity when faced with difficult people or situations. "We don't teach people to be doormats," Fletcher explained to a group of teachers who were implementing the Foundation's curriculum in their schools. "We teach them that strength comes from choosing your response rather than simply reacting. When someone attacks you, you have options. You can attack back, you can retreat, or you can respond in a way that demonstrates your character. The third option is usually the most powerful." The Foundation's most successful program was called the Choice Point, which helped participants recognize the moment in any conflict when they could choose their response. Using role-playing exercises and real-world scenarios, participants learned to pause, assess their options, and choose responses that aligned with their values rather than their immediate emotions. Richard's involvement with the foundation had begun 2 years after his release from prison, when he had approached Fletcher about making a substantial donation. Fletcher had been initially skeptical of Richard's motives, but Richard's proposal was different from what he expected. "I don't want to just write a check and feel better about myself," Richard had told Fletcher during their second meeting. "I want to work with you. I want to tell my story to young people so they can learn from my mistakes. I want to be useful for something other than serving as a bad example." Fletcher's decision to accept Richard as a partner had been controversial, even among his closest supporters. Many people felt that Richard didn't deserve the opportunity for redemption, that his transformation was convenient rather than genuine, and that his involvement would undermine the foundation's credibility. But Fletcher's judgment proved sound. Richard's speeches to young people about his fall from wealth and power to prison and disgrace were devastatingly effective. He didn't minimize his behavior or ask for sympathy. Instead, he used his story as a stark illustration of how character failures could destroy everything a person thought they valued. "I had everything," Richard would tell audiences of teenagers and young adults. "Money, success, a beautiful family, respect in my community, and I threw it all away because I thought being wealthy meant I could treat people however I wanted. I learned the hard way that character matters more than anything else, and once you lose it, it takes years to rebuild." The most powerful moment in Richard's presentations came when he described watching the video of his encounter with Fletcher for the first time in prison. "I saw myself through other people's eyes," he would say. "I saw a wealthy, entitled man attacking someone who couldn't fight back, and then I saw that same person respond with grace and dignity. The contrast showed me exactly who I had become and who I wanted to be instead." The foundation's impact extended far beyond their formal programs. The story of Fletcher and Richard's transformation from enemies to partners had become a powerful example of the possibility for redemption and reconciliation. Their joint appearances at conferences and schools drew large audiences, not just because of their celebrity, but because they represented hope that even the worst behavior could be overcome through genuine change. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the Oxford professor who had written about the original incident, conducted a longitudinal study of the foundation's impact. Her research found that schools using the foundation's programs showed significant reductions in bullying incidents and improvements in how students handled peer conflicts. More importantly, students who participated in the programs demonstrated better emotional regulation and more sophisticated conflict resolution skills years after completing the training. What Fletcher and Richard have created together is more powerful than what either could have accomplished alone. Dr. Hartwell wrote in her final report, "Fletcher's example shows the power of maintaining dignity under attack, while Richard's transformation demonstrates that people can change if they're willing to do the hard work of examining their behavior and committing to something better." The foundation's work had also attracted international attention. The United Nations invited Fletcher to speak at a conference on peacekeeping and conflict resolution. The European Union provided funding for the foundation to expand its programs to schools across Europe. Military academies in 12 countries had incorporated the foundation's training into their leadership development curricula. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Queen Elizabeth II, now in her late 90s, requested a private meeting with both Fletcher and Richard to learn about their work together. The meeting, held at Windsor Castle, lasted nearly an hour and focused on the practical applications of the principles they were teaching. "What you two have accomplished together gives me great hope," the Queen told them. "Mr. Fletcher, your initial response showed the world the power of maintaining one's principles under pressure. Mr. Pemberton, your transformation shows that redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the difficult work of changing themselves. Together you represent something that our world desperately needs. Proof that grace and redemption can triumph over conflict and hatred." The Queen's blessing provided the foundation with additional credibility and resources, but it also marked a personal milestone for both men. For Fletcher, it represented recognition that his quiet approach to leadership and service was having a genuine impact on the world. For Richard, it symbolized complete acceptance of his transformation from a figure of shame to someone whose story could inspire positive change. As they left Windsor Castle together that day, Fletcher and Richard reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them from that morning at Buckingham Palace to this moment of shared purpose. Neither man could have imagined that an encounter, rooted in conflict and humiliation, would eventually become the foundation for work that was helping thousands of people learn to respond to adversity with dignity and grace. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had reacted differently that day, Fletcher mused as they walked toward their car. If I had broken protocol and responded to you with anger. Richard considered the question seriously. I probably would have felt justified in my behavior, he admitted. Your anger would have confirmed my belief that I was the victim, but your grace forced me to confront who I really was. It took years for me to understand that. But your handkerchief saved both of us that day. Their work together continued to evolve and expand, touching new communities and inspiring new programs around the world. The handkerchief that had started it all remained on display at the Imperial War Museum, but its true legacy lived on in the countless people who had learned to choose dignity over retaliation, grace over revenge, and redemption over despair. The foundation they had built together stood as proof that even the most unlikely partnerships could create positive change, and that the simple act of maintaining one's character under pressure could ripple outward to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. In a world often defined by conflict and division, Fletcher and Richard's story offered something precious and rare, evidence that dignity, grace, and the possibility of redemption could triumph over even the ugliest human impulses. Their partnership would continue for many years to come, touching countless lives and proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest acts of human decency. The handkerchief Fletcher had offered on that distant morning had become a symbol of hope for anyone facing their own choice point between reaction and response, between who they had been and who they chose to become.